our study of all the fascinating topics related to end times type discussions. And today we got a real interesting one. We're going to talk about the idea of an Antichrist. It's one of those ideas that has grown larger in the popular culture than it ever did in the Bible. When you read the Bible, there's actually a very limited amount of info when it comes to the Antichrist. The phrase or term Antichrist is used in only 3 passages in the entire Bible, all of them in the letters of John. Now, there are some other passages that sound like they might be referring to the same thing or person, and we'll cover a few of those today. But you think about how often that phrase comes up, Antichrist, compared to just 3 passages that say something about it. And in those 3 passages, even they leave us with a couple of questions. The biggest that we'll have to tackle is whether the term Antichrist refers to one specific person we should be waiting for, or to a type of person, of which there might be many who fit that type of person. So the first passage, and we'll just kind of poke through these one at a time, begins in 1 John 2 and verse 18. Children, it is the last hour, and as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Therefore we know that it is the last hour. So if that were written yesterday, I would think that he meant, at last the Antichrist has arrived. The catch is it was written nearly 1900 years ago, right? And the way he even words it there is odd. Notice that he says both singular and plural. Antichrist is coming. Antichrists, plural, are already here. That tells me that this may not be a reference to one specific person, but rather a type of person of whom there might be very many Antichrists. Antichrist is both currently present in the 1st century, where John said he's already here, and would continue into the future. He is coming. So just if we only had that verse to work with, we would assume that there were Antichrists in the 1st century, and there were Antichrists throughout history, and there have been maybe Antichrists today, maybe there's bunches of them, which is definitely a different picture than probably a lot of us would have thought from the way it's talked about among other people. 1 John 2, 19 to 20 then continues. They went out from us, this is speaking about the Antichrists, they went out from us, but they were not of us. And if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out, that it might become plain that they are all not of us. But you have been anointed by the Holy One, and you all have knowledge. So the Antichrist, the they in that passage, originated within the church. I think we probably think that it's going to be some outside influence that attacks the church. But that's not the way John describes it. John says the Antichrist left us. The Antichrist began in the church and left the church, which is probably, again, a different picture than the way we might have thought of it. Furthermore, the church knew who they were. Who were the Antichrist? Well, it's the people that got up and left your church. There had been some kind of problem in the churches to whom John is now writing, specifically about Jesus, something to do with the doctrine of Jesus. We'll see that in another verse here. And some people had left. And John says they left because they are antichrist. They oppose the truth of Christ. And you know who they are. So he continues in verses 21 to 23. I write to you not because you do not know the truth, but because you know it, and because no lie is of the truth. Who is the liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and the Son. No one who denies the Son has the Father. Whoever confesses the Son has the Father also. Let what you heard from the beginning abide in you. Well, that's as close to a literal definition as you're likely to get. Who are the Antichrists? The Antichrist was literally someone who denied the Son or some essential truth about the Son. There was something about Jesus that they were denying that was essential to Christian faith. And because of that, they left the church. And John says, you know who they are, you know what they believe in, you know it's a lie. The doctrine of the Antichrist was a doctrine about Jesus himself. It was not just a generally false idea. Every time somebody comes along with a bad idea, there'll be somebody to shout, that's the doctrine of the Antichrist. But it's specifically about Jesus, right? It's a doctrine about Jesus that John says, well, it's anti-Christ. It's opposed to Christ because it's false doctrine about Jesus himself. And these are people who had left that church. And so John just tells them, you shouldn't be surprised. We knew that there would be some people who were anti-Christ. And these people proved that they are anti-Christ because they left the church over a doctrine about Christ. So it is. So in that passage, it's not strange or weird at all. It's very simple, actually. And you'll find in John's writing that's often the case. 1 John 4, 1 through 3, just a chapter or two later, very similar discussion. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you had heard was coming and now is in the world already. He just repeats what we said, didn't he? Number one, again, the spirit of Antichrist did not confess Jesus is from God. He was specifically denying something very specific about Jesus, that Jesus Christ had come in the flesh and is from God. I suspect that this is related to a heresy that developed in the church in the early centuries that we know about called Gnosticism. This is somehow connected to that. The Gnostics believed everything material, everything flesh and blood or that you could touch or that was in this material world was wrong, was evil, was decadent in some way or decaying. And the goal was to escape reality. Well, when Christians said Jesus, our God, came in the flesh, the Gnostics said, well, if he's in the flesh, he can't be good. And so the Gnostic Christian heresy was maybe God came, but he wasn't really flesh and blood. Maybe it just appeared that he was flesh and blood. And John says, no, it's not going to work. Jesus was born, Jesus lived, Jesus died, Jesus was buried, Jesus was raised from the dead. All those things he did in his flesh. So to deny that is to deny the gospel itself and to make yourself the spirit of Antichrist, he says. And again, notice the spirit of Antichrist was in the world already in the first century. John doesn't say, one of these days Antichrist will come. He says, it's right here and you've met them. And then one more place in John, this time 2 John, verses 7 and 8, says, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. So here again, the Antichrist, referred to here as such a one, were those who did not confess that Jesus was the Christ come in the flesh. It had something to do with Jesus literally coming as a human person that was bothering these people, and they denied it. And John says, if you're going to deny that, you're denying the whole gospel, and you can't be part of us. You are anti-Christ. And then he says, again, what we've already read, they are no longer in the church. They've gone out into the world. They've left. Deceivers have gone out into the world. They didn't come from the world. See, that's the way we usually think of it. The deceivers come from the world into the church. He said, no, these deceivers left the church and went out into the world. Verses 9 through 11 says much the same thing. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him or takes part in his wicked works. So John says the Antichrist were from the church, but they were no longer within the church, and the church was not supposed to partner with the Antichrist because they were anti-Christ, right? And the church is very pro-Christ, not anti-Christ. So the doctrine of the Antichrist from John's teaching is that any person, including the people that they had met in their churches, any person who would turn around and deny the essential doctrine of Jesus Christ in the gospel was Antichrist. And that's not mysterious at all. We tend to think there's some future foreboding world leader, not in John's writings. In John's writing, it's somebody that was in the church who then turned around and denied the doctrine of Christ. He says, you're Antichrist. And that could be anybody, not just a famous general or something. There are some other passages of interest. There are a couple in Revelation we want to talk about, but I'm going to do 3 lessons just on Revelation at the end of this class, so we'll skip those for today. We're also going to do a lesson just on Matthew 24, but I thought I'd mention this anyway. Matthew 24, 24 through 26, Jesus says, false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand, so if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. This actually is a little different than an antichrist. This is a false Christ. An antichrist is not someone claiming to be Jesus or not claiming to be the Christ himself. An antichrist was someone who denied something about Christ, who opposed Christ's truth in some way. The false Christ is someone who is actually claiming himself to be the Christ. And we know there were a handful of folks like that in the first century world. There are people like that today. There are some folks out there that say, actually, I'm the very Son of God. They're rare, but they exist. And Jesus says, yeah, that's going to happen. When it happens, you don't have to believe them. Why? Because I've already told you that I'm the Christ, and that means that other guy isn't. Now, possibly the most difficult passage in the New Testament talking about the coming of some specific person is in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. We're going to cover it now. I'm just going to confess right up front, I don't have all the answers about this one. I would love for there to be 3 Thessalonians that said, here's what 2 Thessalonians meant, but I don't have it. But I can give you the information as it seems apparent. This comes from 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 and 2, which we've actually read a couple times in other lessons. Now, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, we ask you, brothers, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by a spirit or a spoken word or a letter seeming to be from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Okay, so the Thessalonians were very concerned about the coming of Christ. It's discussed in the first letter to the Thessalonians and discussed again in the second letter. It seems that some thought either the second coming of Christ was imminent, like any minute, and they should just stand outside and wait for it. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, it seems some of them had quit their jobs thinking, any minute now. And Paul says, yeah, go back to work. And then some may have even feared that it had already happened. In 2 Timothy 2, 16 and 18, it talks about people who were teaching the resurrection had already passed. So there was just some confusion about what that meant for them. And that seems to be what Paul's trying to address here. In verse 3 and 4, then he explains a little. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first. And the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Okay, what's that mean? First, note that the phrase comes first, right? The day will not come until something else comes first. Doesn't even necessarily mean that one event would happen immediately after the other. And I think that's the way this is usually read. That could be the case. It could mean this event will happen and then immediately Christ will come back the second time. Or it could mean this will happen first and then 20,000 years later, Christ will come back the second time. All he says is this has to happen first. What has to happen first? 2 things that are connected. One is the rebellion. This is from a Greek word where in English we get our word apostasy, means a falling away from the truth. And then also the man of lawlessness would be revealed. Okay. Whereas the other passages we read sound very generic, and this one could be too, but it sounds more specific. John said, there are lots of antichrists in the world right now. Here Paul says there's going to be a man of lawlessness revealed. And I'm not sure what to do with that, so we're going to keep reading. What do we know about him? He is the son of destruction. He opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship. He takes his seat in the temple of God, and he proclaims himself to be God. What questions might we have for this? Well, I've got lots of them. Paul, would this happen near in time to you writing this letter? Or is this something way down the line in the future? He doesn't actually say. Only that it has to happen before Christ comes back, which is a pretty big window, apparently. How long after the falling away would the end come? Would it be, as we said a moment ago, this rebellion happens and then immediately the end comes? Or would it be this rebellion happens and then thousands of years later the end comes? And then a third question that's really tricky is, what's the temple? Christians don't have a literal temple in a geographic location. So what's he talking about? It could be literally the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, or it could be figuratively like the church is the temple of God. The people are the temple of God. That's referred to in Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 3 and also 6. So that's possible. So I got lots of questions, no answers, so we're going to keep reading. This is 5 through 7. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things, and you know what is restraining him now, so that he may be revealed in his time? For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains it will do so until he is out of the way. So that one, again, very cryptic. It's funny to me that Paul says, don't you remember I told you this? And I want to say, no, I've never heard this before. Where did you say this? But of course, I wasn't there when he was talking to them. Someone or something was restraining this man, the son of destruction, at the time of Paul's writing. That he couldn't do what he wanted because someone at that time or something was restraining him, so he couldn't have his way. But then also Paul says these events were already at work. So to our previous question, Paul, are you talking about something way down the future or something near to your time? He seems to think the beginnings of it, at least, are already at work in the first century. So, just kind of put some limits on this now. When somebody says, I think, go back to 1970-something. I think the son of perdition is somebody in the Soviet Union. Okay. What does the Soviet Union have to do with what was already at work in the first century? Why would Paul say it's already started? And what would that have to do with anything happening in Russia in the 70s? So you see the problem? Whatever he's talking about, he says it's already started. And that's 1900 plus years ago, almost 2 full millennia. So that puts a little wrinkle in it, that when you jump to it's really popular to read this and say it's about something happening in the news today. It could be, but it would have to have something to do also with what was going on 2,000 years ago. There's some connection. Something was preventing it from getting out of hand then, but it was already started. Okay. Verse 8, then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. So the second coming of Jesus would kill the lawless one or destroy him. The big point being Christ will win, the lawless one would lose. Okay, and that's the point. Verses 9 through 10, the coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. So what we learn from that passage, the lawless one is not Satan himself. There's been a few that thought that. Can't be, because he says he works by the activity or the influence of Satan. Like Satan, this person being described is a deceiver, a liar, but he's not Satan. So then in verses 11 and 12, therefore God sends them a strong delusion, so they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. So that passage seems to say that God would allow the deception to spread and thereby distinguish between those who loved the truth and those who did not. Okay, what am I supposed to do with that passage? That's tough. Part of it sounds like it was happening in Paul's time. Part of it sounded like it was maybe down the road. It's really difficult. I don't have any clear answers. I think the general point of the text is really clear. Paul's saying the end of the world, the second coming of Christ, isn't yet. You Thessalonian Christians, don't get too worried. There are still things that have to happen. Things had to get bad before they got better. So I think some people thought, oh, good, Christ is coming. It's going to be nothing but good days ahead. And Paul's saying, oh, no, there will be a lot of tough days ahead. But Jesus wins in the end. There will be evil. It will fight against good, but Christ wins in the end. So love the truth of God is the overall picture of that chapter. You can get that out of it without knowing any of the specifics. What are some of the interpretive options? One of the real difficulties is there's never been a consensus. Throughout church history, I can show you just about anybody you want to name has an opinion on it, and they all disagree. Irenaeus is one of the earliest interpreters of this passage in the early century of the church. Irenaeus says that this son of perdition was a Jewish false Christ in the first century. Perhaps someone like Simon Bar Kokhba, who rebelled and was killed in 135 AD. Irenaeus believed the falling away would originate in the literal temple in Jerusalem. This was about the Jewish rebellion, is what he thought it was. Okay. Tertullian lives after Irenaeus, and he says, no. It's the evil at work in the Roman Empire. It was toppling civilization and making way for greater evil from the barbarian tribes to come into the Roman Empire. Okay, he thought nothing to do with Jews, had to do with barbarians. Skip forward to the Protestant Reformation. John Calvin says it's the Catholic Church, and the son of perdition is the Pope himself. And the falling away was all the corrupt popes that had happened throughout history. And that's just a sample of it. I mean, I can give you a list. Some say it's Nero Caesar in the first century. Some say it's Napoleon in France. Lots of people said it was Hitler. There are people who thought it was Kissinger or maybe Gorbachev. Basically, anyone you don't like. If you don't like somebody, say, you know who that is? That guy must be the son of perdition. He's here to overthrow the world. Here's something to keep in mind. I don't know the specifics on this one. I can't give you an answer because Paul didn't give us enough to work with. I think the Thessalonians knew what he was talking about. I'm just not sure. But here's what I can say for sure. So far, everyone who thought they could identify the Antichrist and anticipate the second coming has been wrong. Like everybody who said, I know who it is, and now Jesus will come. Well, Jesus hasn't come back, right? So either that wasn't the son of perdition, or the coming of the son of perdition didn't mean that Christ would come immediately. I mean, Irenaeus, the first guy we mentioned, he could have been right. Maybe it was the Jewish rebellion. But all that means is that was a rebellion against God and didn't mean Jesus was coming back because he hasn't yet. So it's just not clear what to do with that. But I can say we have a really bad track record of pretending we know the answer and being wrong. So I'm always suspicious personally when somebody says, I know exactly who that is, and it's somebody in the newspaper today, because throughout history, we've done that a lot, and we keep being wrong about who and what it is. We're going to have to be content then to agree on the big point, not the specifics. And what's the big point? Just the fact that Jesus came in the first century didn't mean the battle was over. Yes, Jesus won, God wins, but evil was still going to have its day. There were going to be good days and bad days for Christians for all the centuries to come, and they're still all today. But the rest of the story is Jesus wins in the end, and we're supposed to be patient for that. We don't sit outside and wait for Christ to come back and don't do anything. Paul says, no. Don't worry about that. But when Jesus comes, he wins. And that's the big picture.